Thank you, Douglas. Right, so before we take a few questions from the audience, I'll kick off. Whoa. Right, I'm suddenly on. First, an easy one to start with. So how do you keep the sort of energy up that you sort of explode into the room when you're talking?
Oh, thanks, Howard.
Most talkers, is it caffeine? Is it Red Bull, or is it a planned thing? Because most speakers sort of tail off after about 3 minutes.
Yeah, the energy in what we do when we present, I think it's very much a learnable technique if it's something that you are interested in. My presentation on how to be an expert has evolved so much over time because I want to keep it interesting for me. I've been speaking on this topic for about 10 years now, but you wouldn't recognize this presentation from 8, 9 years ago. And I think just by reading different things, listening to Audible and so on, you keep it fresh for yourself. And if it's fresh for you, it's fresh for the audience.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you've spoken about many people who are icons, and obviously that's your game. You've looked at a lot of icons. What would be the one characteristic, their personality trait, that you would say is most demonstrated by icons? Is there one thing which makes it easier to be an icon? Because I liked your idea that I could be Michael Jackson, but I think it might be difficult.
Okay, tying on to that, you never know.
That one, eh?
Tying on to that idea that you're helping them to sort of become who they want to be. I find that some of the most effective experts in different industries talk in moving pictures. What I mean by that is if you take someone like a Jeremy Clarkson, how many thousands of motoring journalists are there around the world? And then there's Clarkson. What does he do differently? Instead of doing these kind of overloads of information where it's all dots and dashes and data, he speaks in metaphors and word pictures. And I think that's largely the thing that sets him apart. Now, I think it comes very naturally to him. If you read his books, his Sunday columns sound exactly like what you would hear on Top Gear and the new show, The Grand Tour. But I think the best speakers, the best writers, the best presenters and experts in any industry get people living in their imagination. There's a lot of research behind this as well. Whenever you find yourself really bored at a conference, pay attention to when you look back up again. It's usually at the start of a story. It goes like this. So, dots and dashes and conference and numbers and these are the things. You know, the other day I walked into a division and people look up again because it ignites something in the mind. And we can do that on purpose. When you turn your points, your ideas, into stories, metaphors, and visuals, it changes something for the audience.
Okay, and you mentioned of your 3 things important for an icon, you mentioned knowledge.
Oh, I forgot one, didn't I?
You mentioned 2, but I was browsing through your books. I know there are actually 3.
Yeah.
But you mentioned knowledge, which brought us some heart as a business school. How important is knowledge, or is knowledge becoming more of a commodity? Is it really more about charisma and how you communicate things than actual knowledge? Has knowledge become commoditized to an extent?
Okay, knowledge, necessary but not sufficient. You cannot do without it. And I think what also happens is the more you do know your stuff, the more ideas per sentence you tend to use. And it has that, everything has more subtlety and nuance to it, to the point where your audiences and your markets say things like, this person, this man, this woman clearly knows their stuff. Because of that subtlety, that nuance, that depth. And I've heard speakers say that, you know, for every idea that you speak about for 10 minutes, you should be able to go 3 hours deep. So the knowledge is necessary, but not sufficient. Knowledge on its own can make you a technical specialist, but it doesn't make you stand out in your field. And it's a bit of a glib example, how many doctors do you know as famous icons? When you think about the ones on television, suddenly these become thought leaders and guides and gurus. And they're not necessarily more qualified than the GP that you see every week, but they have that platform. And actually, just to come back to that, the 3 qualities, it was knowledge, personality, publicity. So you've got to take the knowledge and the personality on a roadshow, show it to the world. Yeah.
So does Clarkson actually know about cars?
Clarkson is actually surprisingly intelligent. He acts the buffoon. The man is unbelievably bright. One of the ways in which you can determine intelligence from writing is the use of metaphors. We think of a metaphor as almost sort of a childish thing to say, it's like a hamster in a running wheel, or it's like a this. It's actually a sign of massive intelligence. Because what it does is it cuts through clutter and gets to the heart and soul of a thing. Again, Steven Pinker in the book, The Sense of Style, talks about why speaking in metaphors and word pictures is a sign of high intelligence. Clarkson is much more intelligent than he portrays himself to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so 2 more questions from me, and then we'll start taking some from the audience. So if you'd like to start thinking up some particularly difficult questions, that would be good. Okay, so I mean, the business school, we have lots and lots of people who are effectively specialists. And how do you, so I mean, you could be in a rut. You're pretty much specialist in your area. How do you get out of that rut and sort of reach for the next level of being an icon?
Yes.
And encourage that. What do you do if someone's already occupying that space? So if you're the second best bodybuilder, as you used in your example,
Yeah.
how do you try and trump? It's probably a bad word these days. How do you try and exceed the icon?
You know, you say that, but it worked for Trump, didn't it?
It's not a great example.
Yes, you can't depose Nikki from her throne. If you are number 2 in that industry, you need to be distinctly different and something else. Once again, that book that I mentioned, that Alan Weiss and $1 Million Consulting, he speaks about a company that he worked with that played again for sort of perpetually for 2nd and 3rd place. And they were desperately frustrated by this idea until he pointed out to them, you cannot depose the king in that industry. You need to be the leader in a different way. You actually need to become something unrecognizable from the competition. And I think if you have been in an industry for a very long time, it's surprisingly easy to get into a rut. It can happen even at the entry level of an industry. And I'll show you how it happened to me. I started off the first 5 or 6 years as a professional speaker. I charged a certain fee. And a very kind gentleman friend of mine named Paul Dutoy took me aside and he said, Doug, your fees are going to kill you. They are too low. He says they are a credibility disaster. And he says the biggest problem is you think you're worth that little, and it's going to be hard for you to raise your fees later. And he said, I hereby demand that you double your fees. And I can remember at the time thinking, and in fact I said this to him, it was like, you know, Paul, I mean, come on, it's like apocalypse, locusts swarming across the earth, death, the undead, everything will go wrong. He said, you don't have to understand it, you don't have to believe it, you double your fees and you get back to me in a couple of months. To my great surprise, not only did the work taper off, it actually increased quite dramatically. And I think that's an incredibly difficult psychological thing to understand when you are new in an industry, is that our own perception of price can actually be damaging. Being cheap is not good. I was at a speaker's retreat just a few weeks ago where some very high-level speakers were talking about pricing, and to our mutual surprise, one guy who'd been around in the industry was charging about 1/3 of what the rest of us were charging, and he was kind of the veteran in the room. And all of our jaws dropped and we kind of had a pile-on with this guy where we said, you need to triple your fees. And he couldn't see his way to believing that. One of the other speakers said, imagine the scenario. You are a buyer somewhere in Dubai or London or Tokyo, and you're going to bring in a speaker who speaks on lessons from nature, which he happened to do, from South Africa. Now, here are the 3 people that your PA has chosen. This one is charging 50 grand, that one is charging 65, you're charging 15. Guess who gets disqualified out of hand? You're too cheap. It's a difficult rut to get out of. There is a lot of psychology behind it, and the psychology matters.
Absolutely. Okay, and one last question from me, and that is, as we said, we'll take some questions. You mentioned about selling your worth and not selling by the hour.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the eternal problem that ad agencies have, right? Is how to monetize great ideas.
Yes.
How do you go start down that road? Because, I mean, people understand paying per hour.
Yeah.
They don't understand paying vast amounts of money for a concept, an idea, or a person. So how do you start to move down that road?
Yes. Okay, the starting point on that one is to realize up front that when you are seen as the more expensive option, it is not necessarily out of hand a disqualifier. In fact, it raises people's curiosity. They say, why? Why is this offering so disproportionately expensive? That why is an invitation to answer the question. And that's what we want. We want to answer that question, say, because. And the because is the value that you know you can deliver. Now, of course, we are talking about the top end of a spectrum. You can't do this from the word go. You have to have the track record, you have to have the results, and that's why there is always this tipping point in terms of becoming an expert. You are not an expert from the word go. You start off as the novice, the amateur, the working drone, and you work your way up. There comes a point where there is that tipping point and they start coming to you. And that's what we're after. It's demonstrable value, where you have, in the world of coaching and public speaking, it would be, say, testimonials from clients. In the world of advertising, it might be sales results of 1 million units sold. It's that provable, demonstrable before and after result. Now, that before and after is actually an incredibly powerful thing as well. We tend to get stuck on the delivery mechanism of the thing we do. Say, for example, in my world, I am not selling a speech. That's the wrong way to look at it. I sell cultural change within an organization, or the ability to innovate, or whatever the case might be. And I think a lot of South African companies do fall into this trap, where they sell the delivery mechanism, whether it's the speech, the product, the training, whatever the case might be, rather than the outcome. And it's the emphasis on the desired outcome and the ability to prove that you can do that for them that changes the game.
Excellent. Right, let's open it to who's the first brave soul who would like to ask. The gentleman at the back starts us off. Yes, you. Oh, gentleman with his hand in the air.
Thank you, Douglas, for an excellent presentation. I think the ideas all sound very logical, very sensible, and very achievable. I'm sure most of us will agree. Yeah, accepting that knowledge can be learned by virtually all of us, and accepting that publicity can be practiced and learned by virtually all of us, is it not then that the unique personality of the individual is what's going to differentiate the icons from the rest?
Yes, I very much believe that. Sorry, have I interrupted you there?
And then, if that's so, how do we unlock our unique personality? Because I think that's what most of us are frightened of, and that's what most of us have a real challenge with.
Yes.
But most of us will accept that when we allowed our real personality to come through, that's when we stood out.
Yes. Okay, it's an excellent question. The whole dynamic around unleashing your personality on the world. Most people do not suffer from the kinds of problems that Clarkson has. Clarkson divides the world into, half the world sort of praises him, the other half wants to burn him at the stake. Clarkson doesn't care. For most of us, we tend to be on the opposite side of that spectrum, where we are terrified of any kind of negative publicity. One of the things I believe is if you don't have dislikes on your YouTube video, if you are not being sufficiently controversial, you're actually not showing enough of your personality, your stands on certain issues, and so forth. Spoiler alert, if you are a big personality, you are going to have negative feedback. It is inevitable. It is also not even necessarily a bad thing. You obviously don't just want to go out there and try and anger people left, right, and center. You could end up president of the United States.
Accidentally.
But a certain amount of controversy certainly does help. It gets you out there. Now, what I tend to believe in is not being affectatious with anything. And what I mean by that is when you show your personality to the world, for heaven's sake, don't put on an eye patch, take out a cigar, and have a parrot on your shoulder. You don't want to overdo it. You simply want to let who you are begin to emerge. If you find that you're pretty good with, say, humor, start to play that up a little. If you find that you're a very caring, nurturing person, well, let that come out. It's a case of not hiding who you are. And for heaven's sake, don't try to change who you are. You and I are not Jeremy Clarkson. He really is that way. That's what he's like in private. That's what he's like on stage. You want to take your own natural personality and show it to the world. You can consciously start to add storytelling, humor, emotion to the things that you do. You then want to experiment with what works and what feels logical to you. You might be a contrarian. The book that I recommended earlier, Alan Weiss, describes himself as intentionally, he is a contrarian, is what he does. Whatever is the big fad at the moment, he goes the other way on purpose and he ruffles feathers. But he is that way. That works for him, that feels natural. If that's you, go for it. If it isn't, don't. So there is actually quite a lot in the book about that idea of the sort of the emerging personality. I think the guiding principle is keep it authentic, but show it to the world.
An excellent start. Right. Gentleman at the front.
I'm just thinking out loud in terms of, and your points are well taken, but I'm just thinking in terms of timing and persistence, how much of a role does that play? Because, for instance, if you think about Elon Musk, if Elon Musk was in the tech industry in the 70s, he probably wouldn't have done well. The same as, right? Trump in a different era wouldn't have done well playing to his personality as he's done well now. So there's a certain set of circumstances that basically made him win, so to speak. So how much does, I mean, if I now start putting myself out there in a specific style or unique style, it may not work maybe in the next 5 years,
Yeah.
but maybe it might work in 30 years.
It's a great observation. Let's take Elon Musk. Elon Musk is surprisingly, he's actually not tech-driven. He is principle-driven. When you listen to his biography, and again, I've listened to this one on Audible, what he's gone through would kill your average human being. I mean, he has had an astonishing life, and the story is not done yet by any means. But he is driven by the idea of making us an interplanetary species, of making us energy independent, and a few other ideas like that. He reckons, and I think it's a good thought, you can get rid of terrorism by making the West energy independent. That's one of his driving principles. Then he went, okay, how do we do that? Enter Tesla. So it wasn't so much that he started with trendy tech and it happened to play into a cause. He started with principles and then founded the tech as a result. His biggest one is genuinely to make us an interplanetary species, and he's working on it and he's succeeding. So very much like David Attenborough, you almost have this kind of unifying theme traveling through time, and the fads of the day change around it, and the tech of the day may change around it, but the driving passion, the conviction, that's the steady line going through it all. So a bit of an abstract answer, but I think that's the way to look at it. If, for example, you get stuck on being an expert in a fad, you might be in trouble. What are the latest ones we've got? It might be a Bitcoin fad, or it might be... I have no thoughts on Bitcoin. But it is a thing that's happening now, and it is not a principle traveling through time. If, by contrast, you were a wealth specialist, and you did something with Bitcoin, fair enough. But if you're a Bitcoin specialist, you may be looking at something that has a timeline.
Excellent. Lady, third from the front. Second from the front. Yes.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for the wonderful insights. My question is related to on the gender parity conversations, gender pay gap, and leveraging gender. So in building an icon, at what point do you stop leveraging gender and just be icon in your industry?
As opposed to female icon, male... Yes. Do you know, that's an interesting one, and I'd love to have a long discussion with you about that. Nikki is the icon, but one of our few female iconic speakers in South Africa. We need more. It's an interesting debate, because the question then becomes, do you champion a uniquely feminine cause, or do you become an icon and forget anything about gender? I don't have a clear answer to that one. I think the question is fascinating. There are opportunities both ways. Looking at a similar one, for example, in the United States, the politics, of course, is very bipartisan. It's kind of one way or the other, and it's pretty much split down the middle. And I reference in the book a couple of the political commentators who have become extremely famous. You may have seen from Canada, Professor Jordan Peterson. Recently relaunched a book called 12 Principles for Living, and he's become very famous in the United States because of his refusal to engage with politically correct speak around gender. Now, whether you agree or disagree with him, the fact is he has become iconic as a result of that, and he may not have become iconic otherwise. You have, for example, political commentators like Ben Shapiro, who is a Jewish conservative arguing against political correctness. And he has tens of millions of followers, and he's incredibly effective at what he does. So in partisan issues that are one against the other, or sort of tribes, there are certainly opportunities to be the hero of that tribe. There are also dangers in that it may be divisive. What do you want out of life? Do you want to unite? Do you want to be the leader of a tribe? You don't have to be divisive to be the leader of a tribe, but it tends to go that way. It's a fascinating conversation. We could spend hours on that one. I wonder, Nikki, is there anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to say, I like to interview people who are experts in their field as well. And it is much easier to think of who comes to mind first in the male sense than it is to find female icons, especially in this country. Mm-hmm. In this country, we have a lot of amazing women, but they are not brands of one.
Yeah.
There are very few. And so I battle when I'm thinking of iconic people in industries in South Africa, to come up with women because they're not talked about, they're not promoted, and I don't think it's all to do with the media not promoting women or the agenda being patriarchal necessarily, but I don't think that we actually build our own brands and promote ourselves. I think there's something around women promoting themselves that is different, comes across as different, or we perceive it comes across as different to men promoting themselves.
Yeah.
It's seen as okay for men to promote themselves. It's seen as, what's the word I'm looking for?
Awkward.
Not even awkward, it's, there's another,
Just not done.
there's another word for it. It's like it's vanity. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a good word. But we would be seen to be vain if we promoted ourselves. But it's quite okay for a man, and that's maybe the national kind of mindset that we're up against. But I think we've got to push on anyway.
Do you know,
if you are an expert, you're an expert. You know what I mean? And we've got to believe in that expertise.
Let me take that into a practical how-to then. If you think back to Felicia, there's a female icon from South Africa, and the show had her name as the title. It was The Felicia Show. And I think that's actually important as well. There's a whole section in the book, and I didn't have time to talk about it tonight, but I'd love to very quickly, about how the strongest transmission of brand wins. Now, Felicia wasn't part of another talk show. It was The Felicia Show. Her name led the show. I'll give you an example of how I made a mistake with that a few years ago. About 10, 11 years ago, I did the ads for Ford on TV. I walked around a little Ford Fiesta and I said, buy it now for $499, da da da. And in my mind, I thought, brilliant, people will see me on TV, a big brand like Ford, they'll take me more seriously. No, here's what happened. I get to gym and people go, aren't you the Ford guy? And worse than that, I get to my car and someone says, I thought you worked for Ford, why don't you drive one? 5 years after the last of those ads went off air, I still had people saying, aren't you the Ford guy? That's a problem. Now, I've got, again, a whole section in the book there that says you don't walk into a bookstore and say, I feel like reading something by Pan Macmillan. I feel like looking for something by Penguin. No, you look for Jeffrey Archer, you look for Stephen King. We don't walk into a record store, go onto iTunes, and look for something by Sony. No, we're after Shakira, and aren't we all? You go for the name. And I think whether you are male or female, getting the name at the forefront is important. We recently had a speaker bureau in South Africa do something interesting where they said, okay, you subsume your name under the brand, you advertise our brand. I think that is a big mistake. It works the other way around. You don't buy a speaker bureau, you buy the star, the speaker, the name. Your name is sacrosanct. Be careful who and what you ally it to. It's one thing if, for example, you're DeMartini and they say, you know, DeMartini uses Parker pens. Perfect, because it elevates you. But when it's kind of Ford and you're just the little guy presenting it, that's a problem. JT Fox. Anyone been to a JT Fox event? Okay, JT Fox comes out to the country and inevitably the next day on social media you'll see hundreds of people standing with JT Fox. And they change their profile pictures to show, here's me standing with JT Fox. And their thought process is understandable. They think, if people see me with JT Fox, they'll think I'm for real. Do you know what they think? They think JT Fox is for real, because you wanted to stand with him. There are lots of little things like that around how your name is represented. Felicia got it right. We need more like that.
Very patient gentleman at the back.
Sorry.
Yes. Join the debate.
Talk to us about Mother Teresa as an icon, but completely reverse of what we're interpreting icon.
Yes, yeah. That's a fascinating idea. We're looking at it from a business perspective. Obviously, she wasn't. And she's a unique example of someone who presumably did this selflessly and became famous as a result. Interesting, fascinating, it shows that it works. She became synonymous with that world. Now, obviously, again, we come back to she wasn't using it from a business imperative, but there has to be something useful in the idea that given you will receive. I've always believed that. I believe strategically, and this is perhaps the more cynical answer, give away your best intellectual property for free. It is also your best marketing. But I do also believe in trying to raise up others around us simply because it's the right thing to do. There's a danger there too. You can end up being approached for so much mentoring that you can't do your own thing. So one of the things I recommend in the book is I say, decide in advance how you're going to give away your best knowledge. So for example, you might have downloadable audio programs, books, whatever the case might be, or every now and again you might do, say, a charity day where you can get a group of people together, train, coach, teach all in one go, but not have to go to constant coffee meetings because you can't. It's actually out of the question at that sort of level.
Can I add something to
Yeah.
that? I think what that also shows is perhaps principle. So what you spoke about earlier. So it's your guiding principle. So, you know, if your guiding principle is like you want to make, you know, you want to do the best with what you have, she was doing the best with what she had at that point. And the same way if you work in a corporate or if you run your own business, you should hopefully be using those principles, whatever it is that guides you. So for instance, okay, and I'm just the wife, and this is why he speaks, because it's the only time he gets to speak. True story. So I work as a compliance officer, believe it or not, and I'm married to a guy who speaks on innovation. But my core guiding principle, I know, right? My core guiding principle is that I believe in justice. So I enjoy my job tremendously because I believe I am standing up for customers, I'm doing what's right for people. So that is a principle to me. I could probably do that same principle very well if I went into politics or if I became a policeman. It's just that I'm living it through a corporate at this point in time. So maybe.
Excellent.
She's
Okay, let's
attractive.
have
I'm gonna try and take
one
her.
last question, and then let's break for eats and drinks. Do we have one more question, or are we ending it there? Okay, let's call it, I think, let's give it a Thank you very much. I'm sure we have a gift for you somewhere. My team is pointing at it. It's hidden around the back. Here we go. Oops. And then, as is tradition at Gibbs, there's eats and drinks outside. Please do join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Much
Thank you.
appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.